Born into limitless wealth, Lord Henry Somerset held the ultimate position of power, standing at the right hand of Queen Victoria. But behind his flawless aristocratic facade was a heavily guarded secret. When his forbidden same-sex affair was exposed, it didn't just shatter his marriage, it threatened to humiliate the British government. Lord Henry Richard Charles Somerset entered the world in 1849, situated at the very apex of a fiercely stratified British society. As the second son of Henry Somerset, the 8th Duke of Beaufort, his existence was woven directly into the fabric of the nation's ruling class. The Beaufort lineage was not a minor aristocratic footnote. It was a cornerstone of the British establishment, tracing its wealth, land, and political influence back through centuries of royal favor and strategic alliances. The family seat, Badminton House in Gloucestershire, stood as a monument to their entrenched power, a sprawling estate that functioned as a regional epicenter of conservative politics, aristocratic leisure, and immense agricultural wealth. Being born into this specific echelon of the nobility meant that from his first breath, Somerset was insulated from the economic realities that governed the lives of the vast majority of Victorian citizens. While the direct inheritance of the dukedom and the bulk of the entailed estates fell to his elder brother, the position of a second son in a family of such magnitude still guaranteed an extraordinary existence. Somerset was granted immediate access to an elite educational pipeline designed explicitly to mold the next generation of imperial administrators, parliamentarians, and military officers. He was educated among his peers, absorbing the codes, the allegiances, and the absolute confidence required to govern. This network of familial and educational connections operated as an invisible, impenetrable shield, opening doors to the highest levels of government and the royal court long before he had to prove any individual merit. He occupied a social stratum that 99% of the British population could never hope to breach, a world where extreme privilege was viewed not as an accident of birth, but as a divine right and a heavy responsibility. Somerset did not begin his life as an outsider pushing against the boundaries of society. He was born at the absolute center of the English power structure, a fact that dictates the trajectory of his eventual downfall. When a man of his specific standing faces ruin, it is never an isolated, private collapse. The aristocracy relied entirely on the perception of its moral and social superiority to justify its disproportionate grip on the nation's wealth and political institutions. Therefore, a scandal of severe legal and moral implications at this level did not merely threaten the reputation of a single man. It actively endangered the prestige of a historic ducal family and shook the foundations of the very institutions he represented. In the claustrophobic, highly surveilled world of the Beauforts, private lives were public commodities, heavily guarded and constantly assessed for their value to the family's legacy. By 1872, Somerset was required to fulfill a fundamental duty of his class, a step necessary to solidify his position as a mature, responsible member of the ruling elite. He married Lady Isabella Caroline Somers Cox, the daughter of the 3rd Earl Somers. Within 19th century high society, marriage was rarely executed on the basis of simple romantic attachment. It was a calculated, highly negotiated legal and social institution. Marriages of this caliber forged critical alliances between powerful bloodlines, consolidated vast fortunes, secured overlapping social networks, and, above all, were engineered to produce legitimate male heirs to carry the dynastic legacy forward. The union between the Beaufort and Somers families was a prime example of aristocratic consolidation, merging two spheres of influence into a single, formidable partnership. 2 years later, the marriage yielded its most crucial requirement: a son, Henry Charles Somers Somerset. The birth of this child cemented Somerset's public standing. He had successfully executed the social blueprint laid out for him. By his mid-20s, he had become the complete public portrait of an ideal Victorian leader. He was a duke's son, a husband, a father, and a man deeply embedded in the traditional structures of British life. This flawless public architecture, however, made the reality of his private desires infinitely more dangerous. The contrast between the rigid, patriarchal expectations placed upon him and the hidden reality of his same-sex life created a fault line that would eventually fracture his entire existence. The marriage with Lady Isabella, designed to be the bedrock of his public persona, ultimately became the arena for his destruction when his private life became an undeniable, uncontainable legal issue. Parallel to his domestic milestones, Somerset's ascent in the political arena was rapid, aggressive, and entirely supported by the weight of his pedigree. He did not have to claw his way into public service. He entered the House of Commons as a Conservative Member of Parliament for Monmouthshire, a constituency where the Beaufort family wielded massive, nearly unquestioned influence. His entry into Parliament was less an election and more an inheritance of local political authority. Within the House of Commons, he aligned himself with the Conservative Party during a period of intense political transformation and imperial expansion. His aristocratic background and unwavering party loyalty caught the attention of the party leadership, paving the way for a rapid elevation within the government. In 1874, under the administration of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Somerset was appointed to the position of Comptroller of the Household. The title of this office often misleads those unfamiliar with the intricate mechanics of the Victorian state. Somerset was not a glorified estate manager, nor did he handle the Queen's personal finances or oversee the daily domestic labor at Buckingham Palace. The Comptroller of the Household was a highly visible, prestigious political appointment tied directly to the royal household. It positioned him firmly within the operational apparatus of the sitting government while simultaneously granting him a prominent daily role in the ceremonial life of the court. Holding this office meant that Somerset carried a white staff of office during state occasions representing the government's authority within the monarch's presence. It delivered immense prestige, facilitated high-level political networking, and provided direct physical proximity to Queen Victoria herself. Before he had even reached the age of 30, Lord Henry Somerset possessed every necessary asset, every crucial alliance, and every prestigious title required to secure a lifelong, dominant presence in the British political ruling class. He was a man holding the very levers of power, shielded by his marriage, his family, and his office, projecting an image of absolute Victorian stability while privately navigating a life that the laws of his own government explicitly condemned. The architecture of Lord Henry Somerset's public existence was a masterclass in Victorian aristocratic design, yet it rested upon a severely unstable foundation. To grasp the sheer volatility of his position, it is necessary to examine the unforgiving legal and social machinery of 19th century Britain regarding same-sex relations. In the late 1870s, the nation operated under an ironclad moral and legal code that made no concessions for the private desires of men like Somerset. This was years before the Labouchere Amendment of 1885, the legislation that would broadly criminalize all forms of gross indecency between men and eventually bring down figures like Oscar Wilde. However, the legal landscape in 1879 was already lethal. Under the Offenses Against the Person Act of 1861, the maximum penalty for sodomy had been reduced from execution to penal servitude, ranging from 10 years to life. This was not a theoretical threat. It was an active, crushing legal reality. For a man occupying Somerset's position, exposure did not merely invite the loss of a parliamentary seat or the quiet closing of drawing-room doors. It carried the legitimate, terrifying threat of criminal prosecution, hard labor, the total obliteration of the Beaufort name, and immediate expulsion from civil society. There existed no framework, no vocabulary, and no social space within the British Empire for a man to openly acknowledge such desires while retaining a fraction of his public life. Somerset's reality was sharply divided. In the daylight, he wielded the authority of the state and the crown. In the shadows, he engaged in actions that the very state he governed had classified as an abominable crime. His public duties and his private life were entirely irreconcilable, locked on a collision course that required only a single spark to ignite. The catalyst that would eventually destabilize Somerset's marriage and political career emerged in the form of Harry Smith, a young man whose name appears in accounts surrounding the crisis. Historical records place Smith at approximately 17 years old during this period. His association with Somerset became important to the allegations that entered the marital dispute, but the surviving evidence is fragmentary. The archives do not allow historians to reconstruct with confidence the circumstances of their first meeting, the precise nature of their interactions, or the motivations of either individual. What can be established more securely is the extraordinary disparity in social position between them. Somerset was a wealthy aristocrat, a member of Parliament, and a royal courtier supported by one of Britain's most powerful families. Smith possessed none of those advantages. This imbalance in age, wealth, status, and institutional influence is historically significant and should not be ignored. At the same time, the fragmentary nature of the surviving evidence makes it important not to assign motives, intentions, or specific conduct that the archival record cannot substantiate. Smith's importance lies primarily in the role his association with Somerset played in the political and marital crisis that followed. When the reality of Somerset's relationship with Smith and the broader scope of his same-sex life finally breached the fortified walls of his marriage, Lady Isabella was violently thrust into a precarious and highly exposed position. History frequently marginalizes the wives in these aristocratic crises, casting them either as vindictive adversaries who mercilessly destroy their husbands or as passive, tragic figures weeping in the wings. Lady Isabella was neither. She was a woman anchored to a system that granted her immense social status but minimal legal autonomy. Upon acquiring undeniable evidence regarding her husband's private conduct, Isabella did not simply confront a broken heart. She confronted a crisis of survival. She was the wife of a duke's son and a highly visible official of the royal household. She was surrounded by a powerful family network and an elite society that held infinitely more structural power than she possessed as a woman. To initiate a legal separation or divorce meant inviting a devastating public scandal. It meant dragging her own name and the future of her young son through the mud of the civil courts and the relentless scrutiny of the British press. The aristocracy despised nothing more than a public airing of its moral failures, and those who initiated such scandals were often shunned regardless of their innocence. Yet the alternative was equally intolerable. To remain silent, to preserve the facade of the Somerset marriage, required her to exist permanently within a completely shattered domestic reality. It demanded that she serve as a willing public shield for a man whose hidden actions actively endangered their household and carried the constant ticking threat of criminal exposure. She was trapped between the devastation of a public scandal and the quiet, suffocating agony of complicity. Isabella possessed evidence that could ruin a prominent member of the Queen's government. The choice before her was not a matter of romantic betrayal. It was a cold, brutal calculation regarding her own self-preservation and the protection of her only child. Lady Isabella's pursuit of legal extraction was immediately hindered by a judicial system designed explicitly to preserve male authority within the domestic sphere. The legal landscape of Victorian marriage was a terrain of stark inequality. Following the passage of the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, the dissolution of a marriage had been moved from the slow, exceptionally expensive ecclesiastical courts into the civil courts of London. This legislation made divorce marginally more accessible to the upper and middle classes, but it firmly codified a brutal double standard regarding the grounds for legal separation. The law operated on the premise that male and female infidelity carried entirely different moral and social weights. A husband could petition the court to dissolve his marriage on the single standalone ground of his wife's adultery. The legal machinery required him only to prove that she had strayed. Her actions were viewed as a direct threat to the bloodline and the legitimate inheritance of property. A wife, however, faced an overwhelmingly higher burden of proof. Female adultery was a severe transgression, but male adultery was often quietly tolerated by the courts as an unfortunate but natural male prerogative. Therefore, a woman could not secure a divorce simply by proving her husband had been unfaithful. She was required by law to prove adultery combined with a secondary aggravating offense. The acceptable aggravating offenses included extreme physical cruelty, bigamy, incest, or sodomy. In this highly restricted legal framework, the accusations surrounding Lord Henry Somerset's private life ceased to be merely a matter of personal betrayal. They transformed into the precise legal ammunition Isabella needed to force a separation. Sodomy carried exceptional legal and social weight in a matrimonial dispute. It was the ultimate devastating trump card a wife could play in a society that otherwise made female independence nearly impossible. By utilizing the accusations regarding his same-sex life, Isabella found the exact mechanism the law required to break the marriage contract. The Victorian legal structure, which had insulated Somerset his entire life, now weaponized his deepest secret against him. Wielding this weapon, however, required immense strategic calculation. Bringing such allegations into a civil court meant dragging the entire matter into the public record. The British press, hungry for scandal among the ruling class, monitored the divorce courts relentlessly. A formal petition detailing the sexual deviance of a duke's son would not remain a private legal dispute. It would become a national spectacle. The aristocracy possessed a fierce instinct for self-preservation, and families like the Beauforts would deploy enormous financial and social capital to crush any threat to their public image. Isabella was not simply taking legal action against a wayward husband. She was initiating a legal war against one of the most entrenched, powerful dynasties in the empire. This was no longer a private domestic dispute. It was a political contagion. Somerset was far too prominent, his connections too deep, for this crisis to be contained within the walls of a London townhouse. He was a sitting member of the Conservative Party, under the leadership of Benjamin Disraeli. The Conservative government built its mandate on the projection of traditional values, national stability, and moral fortitude. Having a highly visible member of their ranks embroiled in a severe sexual scandal threatened to humiliate the party on a national scale. Political opponents would seize upon the scandal, using it as proof of aristocratic decadence and moral rot at the very center of the government. The danger extended beyond Parliament and directly into the royal household. Queen Victoria demanded absolute moral purity from those who served her. The court was meticulously managed to project an image of unblemished familial duty and Christian virtue. Somerset held the office of Comptroller of the household. He was a physical representative of the government within the monarch's inner circle. The realization that a man engaging in criminalized sexual acts was carrying the white staff of office in the presence of the Queen sent shockwaves through the establishment. The aristocracy relied entirely on the illusion of moral superiority to justify its power. Somerset's actions cracked that illusion wide open. The reaction from the British establishment was characteristically decisive, cold, and efficient. The state and the aristocracy did not require theatrical royal decrees or highly publicized trials to eliminate a liability. The machinery of power simply engaged its gears to excise him and protect the whole. The immediate objective was containment. The scandal had to be managed before it resulted in a criminal trial that would permanently stain the government and the Beaufort family. But containment required Somerset's immediate removal from all positions of public authority. As the marriage irreparably fractured, the conflict violently shifted toward the most critical asset the couple shared: their son. In the hierarchy of an aristocratic family, a son is not merely a child. He is a dynastic asset. He represents the continuation of the bloodline, the future inheritor of titles, and the eventual controller of the family's vast wealth. The legal proceedings of the 19th century were labyrinthine, and a father retained immense, almost unshakable default authority over his children. Under common law, children were essentially the property of the patriarch. A mother possessed very few inherent legal rights regarding the custody, education, or upbringing of her own offspring. However, the severity of the allegations leveled against Somerset disrupted this traditional patriarchal leverage. The courts, while biased toward the father, were also bound by the necessity of preserving the moral upbringing of the child. The accusations of gross immorality and illegal sexual conduct provided Isabella with the necessary leverage to challenge Somerset's default authority. The ensuing legal maneuvers over the custody of Henry Charles Somers Somerset were fierce. Isabella did not surrender her child to the Beaufort family. She fought aggressively through the available legal channels, utilizing the sheer toxicity of her husband's secret to secure a highly favorable position regarding the care and custody of their son. Scandal accomplished what standard legal disputes rarely could. It stripped a powerful Victorian patriarch of his authority over his own heir. The year 1879 marked the definitive, irreversible collapse of Lord Henry Somerset's public existence. The crisis reached a critical mass where the walls of aristocratic protection simply gave way. The machinery of the state required a clean, immediate amputation to prevent the rot of a sexual scandal from infecting the wider government. Somerset was forced to resign his position as comptroller of the household. This was not a standard political resignation born of a policy dispute or a shifting electoral map. It was a forced extraction. The white staff of office, the physical symbol of his authority within the royal household, was relinquished in silence. A highly promising political trajectory, cultivated from birth and backed by the immense wealth of the Beaufort dynasty, was terminated with brutal efficiency. The conservative government under Benjamin Disraeli could not afford the liability. Queen Victoria's court, heavily reliant on the absolute projection of Christian morality and familial duty, could not harbor a man actively accused of gross sexual deviancy. The establishment closed ranks. Somerset's name was quietly but permanently struck from the active roster of the British ruling class. The immediate loss of his court position signaled the death knell for his broader political ambitions. He did not immediately vanish from the House of Commons the day he resigned from the royal household. He retained his parliamentary seat for a brief, highly marginalized period, officially concluding his time as an MP around 1880. But his presence in Westminster had become a ghosthood. The House of Commons was an arena driven by alliances, reputation, and the backing of party leadership. Stripped of his court position and trailed by the suffocating smoke of a catastrophic marital and sexual scandal, Somerset possessed zero political capital. His career was not dismantled by a rival party or a mobilized working-class electorate. It was shattered from the inside out by the sheer incompatibility of his private reality with the absolute demands of Victorian public life. Following the events of 1879 and the subsequent loss of his parliamentary seat, Somerset initiated a calculated, necessary withdrawal from the British Isles. He spent the vast majority of his remaining decades living on the European continent. Historical myth-making often injects unnecessary melodrama into this departure. Somerset did not flee a London townhouse in the dead of night with police officers hammering at the doors. The surviving record does not support the narrative of a frantic escape from imminent arrest. His position was nevertheless extremely precarious. The allegations surrounding his private conduct carried potentially serious legal consequences under Victorian law. while the collapse of his marriage had already destroyed much of his political and social standing. Even without an active criminal prosecution, his future within the British establishment had become increasingly untenable. Relocation to the continent therefore provided distance from both the scandal and the institutions in which his career had previously depended. Leaving England was a strategic deployment of his remaining assets. It removed him from the relentless, aggressive scrutiny of the British press. It created a vast physical and jurisdictional buffer between himself and the scandal. Crucially, it drastically mitigated his legal risks. By placing the English Channel between himself and the jurisdiction of the Offences Against the Person Act, he neutralized the immediate threat of a Victorian prison cell. It was an expulsion dressed as a voluntary relocation, allowing him to construct a new existence entirely outside the blast radius of British politics. Here, the stark, unforgiving reality of class privilege becomes undeniably evident. Somerset possessed the financial resources, the international connections, and the sheer social mobility to simply pack up his life, cross the Channel, and establish a comfortable residence in Europe. He hired lawyers to manage the wreckage of his estate and his marriage. He utilized the immense wealth generated by the Beaufort lands to fund an indefinite exile. A working-class man caught in a parallel snare, a clerk, a soldier, a laborer, would have possessed none of these escape routes. For the average British citizen, an accusation of this nature resulted in immediate arrest, a highly publicized and ruinous trial, public humiliation, and years of hard labor in a notoriously brutal penal system, followed by absolute destitution. Somerset avoided the physical brutality of the state's punishment. His privilege insulated his body, but it could not protect his identity. He bought his way out of a prison sentence, but the purchase required him to permanently forfeit the empire he had been born to rule. He escaped the cell, but he could not escape the exile. Somerset eventually settled into the expatriate communities of the continent, with Florence frequently serving as a primary base of operations for his new life. Florence in the late 19th century was a frequent destination for wealthy English exiles, artists, and aristocrats whose reputations had sustained terminal damage back home. However, applying modern terminology to this relocation distorts the historical reality. Florence was not a liberated sanctuary where Somerset could live openly and proudly as a gay man. Late 19th century Europe was not a modern utopia of sexual acceptance. The continent maintained its own strict moral codes and legal prohibitions. Distance, rather than ideological liberation, provided his shield. Living in Italy severed his daily proximity to the Beaufort family estate, the British Parliament, and the watchful eyes of the royal court. In Florence, he operated with a significantly wider margin of privacy. The local society cared far less about the domestic scandals of a displaced English lord than London did. He found a geographical and social space where his personal life no longer posed an active daily threat to a political career he no longer possessed. He traded the raw, immense power of the British establishment for the quiet, insulated distance of the continent. The architecture of his life shifted from the grand state rooms of London to the private villas of Italy. The tension that had defined his entire adult life, the impossible task of holding government office while harboring a criminalized secret, was finally broken. The state had expelled him, and in that expulsion, he found a hollow, heavily compromised form of safety. The reality of this continental exile was defined not by a sudden, dramatic transformation of character, but by an absolute severing of his previous utility. In London, Lord Henry Somerset had been a functional, heavily utilized component of a massive imperial engine. His days had been structured by parliamentary sessions, the rigid protocols of the royal household, the management of political alliances, and the intricate, exhaustive social calendar of the Beaufort family. He possessed a voice that shaped legislation and a physical presence required at state ceremonies. Crossing the English Channel extinguished that utility instantly. He stepped into a reality where his aristocratic title still commanded a superficial level of deference from hotel managers and expatriate social climbers, but carried zero actual weight. He was no longer a lawmaker, he was a wealthy tourist on a permanent visa. This environment demanded a complete reconstruction of his daily existence. The loss of political power creates a specific kind of vacuum. For a man conditioned since childhood to govern, the absence of duty can be destabilizing. Somerset did not retreat into a state of catatonic depression or vanish entirely into the obscured corners of the European underworld. Instead, he initiated a second act that fundamentally challenges the conventional, simplistic narrative of the disgraced, ruined aristocrat. He redirected the energy previously consumed by Parliament and the court into the cultural sphere. Music, which had likely been a cultivated aristocratic hobby during his years in England, became the central organizing principle of his new life. He began to seriously compose and publish music, establishing a respectable, visible presence as a songwriter. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, the market for parlor music and sheet music was vast and highly lucrative. Homes across Europe and Britain possessed pianos, and the demand for new vocal arrangements was constant. Somerset engaged directly with this industry. He produced a significant catalog of work, with pieces like A Song of Sleep achieving notable circulation and recognition. His name, scrubbed from the political registries and heavily censored in polite London society, reappeared on the covers of sheet music distributed across the continent. This phase of his life requires careful, objective analysis, free from the temptation to overly romanticize his output. It is a historical misstep to retroactively analyze every chord progression and lyric Somerset published as a coded, desperate confession of his hidden sexual identity or a secret love letter to the men he was forced to leave behind. There is no archival mandate to view his music purely as a diary of his trauma. The reality is far more practical. Music provided him with a respectable avenue for public achievement when all political avenues were permanently blocked. It offered a structured, intellectual pursuit, a means of engaging with a community of artists and publishers, and a way to exert influence that did not require the approval of the Conservative Party or Queen Victoria. He had lost his grip on state power, but he retained the capacity, the education, and the financial backing to create and distribute art. He proved that an individual could be thoroughly dismantled by the state in one arena and successfully rebuild a functioning public identity in another. Yet, this successful pivot to music only sharpens the central tragedy of his existence. Lord Henry Somerset's biography is a study in absolute dichotomy. It is the story of a single life cleanly fractured into two entirely different halves, separated by the crisis of 1879. The first half is the story of the insider, the Duke's son, the husband, the father, the Conservative member of Parliament, the comptroller of the household. It is the story of a man whose very existence was sanctioned and celebrated by the highest authorities of the British Empire. He walked the corridors of Westminster and stood in the presence of the monarch, draped in the historical authority of his ancestors. The second half is the story of the outsider, the expatriate, the former husband severed from his traditional family structure, the man living on the margins of the British establishment, forced to carve out a quieter, less impactful existence in Italy and France. He possessed a degree of physical safety and perhaps a wider margin for his personal life, but he was forever locked out of the command centers of his own nation. He lived with the permanent, inescapable knowledge that his country had deemed his fundamental nature a criminal offense. This contradiction is the defining feature of his legacy. In England, he possessed almost unlimited social and political power, but absolutely no freedom to exist truthfully. He was forced to construct a dangerous, suffocating facade to survive within the system he helped govern. On the continent, he secured a functional degree of distance and personal autonomy, but the price of that autonomy was the total forfeiture of his power. The Victorian system offered him everything, provided he entirely suppressed a core component of his humanity. When he failed to maintain that suppression, the system confiscated everything it had given him. While Somerset navigated this stark transition in Europe, the wreckage of the scandal continued to shape the reality of those he left behind in England. The narrative focus frequently and unfairly drifts away from Lady Isabella once the separation is secured, treating her merely as a catalyst for Somerset's downfall rather than a primary subject of the historical fallout. She was the victor in the immediate legal skirmish, having successfully extracted herself from the immediate danger of her husband's secret life and secured a favorable position regarding their son. But winning a legal battle in a Victorian court did not guarantee social survival. Isabella was not simply granted a quiet, peaceful life following the collapse of her marriage. She was forced to navigate the punishing, highly judgmental terrain of late Victorian high society as a separated woman. The aristocracy, while occasionally willing to overlook quiet indiscretions, harbored a deep institutional resentment toward anyone who brought scandal into the public record. Even though she was legally recognized as the aggrieved party, the sheer proximity to the allegations surrounding her husband contaminated her social standing. The whispers, the closed doors, and the subtle exclusions were inevitable. She was a woman anchored to a highly toxic public narrative, forced to carry the weight of a crisis she did not author. Furthermore, she faced the immense isolated burden of raising the Beaufort heir. Henry Charles Somers Somerset was still the grandson of the Duke, carrying the bloodline and the expectations of one of the nation's most powerful families. Isabella had to manage his upbringing, his education, and his eventual integration into a society that had violently expelled his father. She operated in a constant state of defensive maneuvering, protecting her son's inheritance and social viability while managing her own marginalized status. She was entirely dependent on her own strategic intelligence to maintain her financial security and social respectability, operating within a patriarchal framework that offered her very little structural support once the marriage contract was broken. The crisis had essentially orphaned her socially, placing her in a unique, highly pressurized purgatory. She could not easily remarry while Somerset lived, nor could she fully reclaim the unimpeded social dominance she had enjoyed as a young bride. Her agency in uncovering the truth and securing her separation was a monumental act of self-preservation, a stark demonstration of how women could strategically utilize the harsh mechanisms of Victorian law to defend themselves. But the victory was cold, and the aftermath required decades of careful, relentless resilience. She stood as living proof that the blast radius of a criminalized sexual identity destroyed far more than just the individual accused. It fractured the lives of women who were legally bound to a system they could not control and married to men they were never permitted to truly know. Surviving record reveals far more about Lord Henry Somerset than it does about Harry Smith. Somerset belonged to one of Britain's most prominent aristocratic families, served in Parliament, and occupied a position within the royal household. His movements, offices, family connections, and political career consequently generated extensive documentation. Smith, by contrast, enters the surviving record primarily through the scandals surrounding Somerset. Beyond that role, reliable information about his life is extremely limited. This imbalance in documentation creates an important historical problem. Smith should not be treated merely as a narrative device in the downfall of a famous aristocrat. Yet the surviving evidence does not provide enough information to reconstruct his motives, personal circumstances, or perspective with confidence. No substantial body of correspondence or testimony from Smith survives in the material commonly cited in accounts of the affair. Any attempt to describe what he thought, wanted, feared, or expected would therefore move beyond what the evidence can securely establish. What can be examined is the enormous disparity in social power surrounding the case. Somerset possessed aristocratic wealth, influential relatives, political connections, access to lawyers, and the ability to relocate abroad when his position in Britain collapsed. Smith possessed no comparable institutional protection. Whatever the precise circumstances surrounding their association, the consequences of scandal in Victorian Britain were profoundly shaped by class. Wealth could provide privacy, legal representation, social connections, and geographical mobility that were unavailable to most ordinary people. This contrast becomes even clearer when Somerset's fate is compared with the treatment of less privileged men accused under Victorian morality laws. Members of the working and lower middle classes generally had far fewer resources with which to defend themselves from prosecution or rebuild their lives after public exposure. Somerset lost his political career, his place at court, and much of his social standing, but aristocratic wealth enabled him to establish a comfortable life on the European continent. His downfall was severe, yet it did not expose him to the same manerial vulnerability faced by people without wealth or influential family networks. The eventual fate of Harry Smith remains poorly documented. That absence should be treated as a limitation of the historical record rather than an invitation to speculation. There is insufficient evidence to determine whether he received financial assistance, remained in London, left the country, maintained contact with Somerset, or disappeared into an otherwise undocumented life. The responsible historical conclusion is therefore a narrow one. Smith played a significant role in the crisis that transformed Somerset's life, but the surviving archive tells us far more about the powerful aristocrat than about the much less powerful individual whose name became attached to his scandal. The system that created Lord Henry Somerset was entirely uncompromising in its demands, yet it possessed a highly sophisticated, deeply entrenched mechanism for managing the catastrophic failures of its own elite. The 1879 scandal tested the absolute limits of aristocratic immunity. To observe Somerset's relocation to the continent is to witness the sheer, brute force of generational wealth and class solidarity in motion. Money, within the Victorian upper echelon, did not merely purchase estates, parliamentary seats, and influence. It purchased jurisdiction. It possessed the power to rewrite the legal reality of an individual. As the allegations surrounding Somerset became increasingly damaging, his family wealth and social position gave him options unavailable to most Victorians facing comparable disgrace. He had access to experienced legal advisors, substantial financial resources, influential family connections, and the ability to establish himself outside Britain. The surviving evidence does not justify assuming the existence of secret settlements, purchased silence, or a coordinated agreement between the Beaufort family and the government. What can be stated more securely is that Somerset avoided a public criminal prosecution and subsequently spent much of his remaining life on the continent. His wealth and social position made such a transition possible in a way that would have been extremely difficult for an ordinary defendant. Somerset's experience, nevertheless, illustrates the protective value of extreme privilege. Generational wealth could not preserve his political career or restore his reputation, but it provided resources that substantially softened the material consequences of his downfall. He could obtain legal representation, maintain financial independence, travel freely, and establish a new life abroad. An ordinary Victorian facing serious criminal allegations would rarely have possessed comparable options. The law formally applied across social classes, but the practical ability to respond to legal and social ruin was profoundly unequal. Yet, treating aristocratic privilege solely as an impenetrable, victorious shield fundamentally misreads the outcome of the crisis. The very same system that rescued his physical body from the penal treadmill simultaneously and mercilessly executed his public identity. The British aristocracy functioned as a highly organized cartel. It protected its members, but that protection was entirely conditional. It required absolute conformity to the public codes of morality, duty, and patriarchal authority. When Somerset broke that contract, and more importantly, when his breach became impossible to deny, the cartel did not hesitate to expel him. They protected the institution by amputating the infected limb. His banishment did not require a formalized royal decree or an act of parliament. The punishment was enacted through a collective, silent agreement among a few hundred elite families. The doors of London society simply closed, locked from the inside. His name was quietly struck from the guest lists of the great country houses. He became a non-entity within the political networks that had defined his entire adult life. The privilege that allowed him to secure a comfortable villa in France or Italy was the exact same privilege that demanded his absolute permanent absence from English soil. He was granted his freedom on the strict condition that he never attempt to exercise power again. The daily psychological reality of this heavily managed exile was stark. Somerset transitioned from a man who actively directed the machinery of the empire to a wealthy spectator entirely severed from the command structure. In London, he had been privy to the internal strategies of the cabinet. He had debated legislation on the floor of the Commons, and he had stood within arm's reach of the monarch. On the continent, he was reduced to reading about the maneuverings of his former colleagues in delayed newspapers. The expatriate communities of Europe offered a superficial facsimile of aristocratic life, dinners, cultural events, interactions with other displaced elites, but it was a hollow existence. The deference he received from hotel managers and local officials was directed at his bank account, and his title, not his utility or his authority. He was trapped in a gilded stasis. He possessed total financial security and the freedom to pursue his musical interests without the crushing pressure of a political career. But that freedom was purchased with the total forfeiture of his legacy. He was the son of a duke who would never again walk the halls of Westminster. He was a father whose relationship with his heir would be permanently mediated by distance and the toxic residue of a historic scandal. He carried the title of a lord, but he governed nothing. The aristocracy demanded that he live out his days in quiet irrelevance, ensuring that his continued existence posed no further threat to the establishment. They required him to become a ghost long before he actually died. The tragedy of his exile was not defined by poverty or physical suffering, but by the absolute, permanent severing of his potential. He survived the crisis of 1879, but the man who emerged on the other side of the English Channel had been thoroughly stripped of everything that made his life recognizable. He was left with the crushing weight of a title that no longer meant anything, living in a freedom that was entirely indistinguishable from punishment. The political environment of 1879 provided no margin of error for a man in Lord Henry Somerset's position. The conservative government under Benjamin Disraeli was navigating a highly volatile period of imperial expansion and domestic anxiety. The administration was engaged in costly, highly publicized military conflicts in Zululand and Afghanistan. The British public was demanding absolute competence and moral fortitude from its leadership. The Conservative Party's mandate was built heavily on the defense of traditional British institutions, the church, the crown, and the patriarchal family. The government required its officials to serve as unimpeachable avatars of these values. Somerset was a highly visible component of this ideological machinery. His position within the royal household was not merely decorative. It was a daily physical assertion of the government's alignment with the moral absolute of the monarchy. The revelation that a man carrying the white staff of office was simultaneously engaging in a hidden, criminalized sexual life threatened to detonate the core ideological premise of the ruling party. The establishment could not tolerate a scandal that would allow political opponents to frame the conservative leadership as a harbor for aristocratic decadence and moral corruption. The swift, brutal ejection of Somerset was an act of political self-preservation. The government did not conduct a public inquiry. They did not debate the nuances of Victorian sexual morality. They identified a massive structural liability and neutralized it instantly. The state's reaction exposes the profound hypocrisy embedded in the British ruling class. The men sitting in Westminster passing severe legislative penalties for moral offenses were fully aware that such behavior existed within their own ranks. The unwritten rule of the aristocracy was not absolute purity, but absolute discretion. Somerset's fatal error was not his desire, but his failure to contain it. When his private reality spilled into the legal framework of a divorce proceeding, he violated the cardinal rule of his class. The system punished him not necessarily for his sexuality, but for forcing the state to publicly acknowledge it. This dynamic reveals the specific cruel genius of the Victorian legal code, particularly concerning marriage and divorce. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 did not emancipate women. It merely shifted the jurisdiction of their subjugation. By forcing Lady Isabella to prove an aggravating offense like sodomy to secure her freedom, the state actively weaponized the domestic sphere. The law presented a woman in crisis with a brutal ultimatum: remain trapped in a destructive, highly dangerous marriage, or completely annihilate the social standing of her husband, her child, and herself in open court. The legal system pitted a disenfranchised woman against a criminalized sexual act, forcing the two most vulnerable elements of the Somerset household to destroy one another, while the patriarchal institution of marriage remained completely intact. Isabella was forced to become the architect of her own social marginalization in order to gain basic legal custody of her son. She utilized the extreme prejudice of the law regarding same-sex relations to break the extreme prejudice of the law regarding female autonomy. It was a vicious, closed-loop system of control that guaranteed heavy casualties for anyone who deviated from the standard domestic blueprint. Somerset's downfall occurred at a critical, transitional moment in British legal and social history. The late 1870s represented a period of relative, though fragile, quiet before the storm of public moral panics that would define the closing decades of the century. He was expelled from society just 6 years before the Labouchere Amendment of 1885 broadened the criminalization of male same-sex activity, and a decade before the explosive Cleveland Street scandal of 1889, which publicly linked aristocrats and telegraph boys in a highly publicized media frenzy. Because Somerset's crisis occurred slightly before the full mobilization of the modern, sensationalist tabloid press, the Beaufort family was able to exert a degree of control over the narrative that would be impossible a decade later. The aristocracy still possessed enough concentrated power to force a blackout among the major publications. The details of Isabella's legal maneuvering and the specific allegations involving Harry Smith were suppressed, kept out of the penny dreadfuls, and confined to the hushed conversations of the elite. Somerset escaped the highly public, performative executions that would later destroy men like Oscar Wilde. He was processed quietly, yet the silence surrounding his exile was a weapon in itself. The Beaufort dynasty absorbed the blow by completely excising him from the family record. The vast financial and social machinery of Badminton House simply closed ranks. His name was omitted from social registers, his presence erased from the official family history. The dukedom prioritized the preservation of the institution over the survival of the individual. Somerset was rendered a non-person by the very bloodline that had previously guaranteed his invincibility. This absolute erasure highlights the central contradiction of Lord Henry Somerset's historical footprint. He was a man who possessed the capacity to draft legislation, command the attention of the Prime Minister, and operate within the innermost circle of the British Empire. He was granted a level of authority designed to shape the destiny of a nation, But the moment his hidden life intersected with the inflexible moral codes of that nation, his authority evaporated completely. The transition from the absolute center of power to the absolute margin of exile was instantaneous. The state required a seamless, unblemished surface. The moment Somerset cracked that surface, he ceased to be a lord of the realm and became a permanent liability, banished to the continent to ensure the machine could continue operating without him. Lord Henry Somerset survived his political execution by more than half a century. The sheer longevity of his exile transforms his biography from a sudden, sharp tragedy into a prolonged, slow-motion erasure. He remained on the continent, primarily entrenched in Florence, while the entire architectural structure of the world that banished him systematically dismantled itself. He outlived the conservative government of Benjamin Disraeli. He outlived Queen Victoria, the monarch whose absolute moral directives required his immediate expulsion from the royal household. He watched from a physical and political distance as the rigid, unyielding Victorian era gave way to the Edwardian period. He survived long enough to witness the outbreak and the devastation of the First World War, a conflict that fundamentally shattered the power and the wealth of the British landed aristocracy. The great country houses, identical in function to the Beaufort estate at Badminton, were converted into hospitals, their heirs decimated in the trenches, the absolute authority of his class irreversibly broken. Somerset witnessed the collapse of the British aristocratic monopoly from the safe, insulated distance of a Florentine villa. He had been frozen in the amber of the 1879 scandal, a living relic of a bygone political crisis, composing parlor music while the empire that had demanded his absence slowly dissolved its 19th century certainties. From this fortified distance, he observed the escalating brutality of the British legal system regarding same-sex relations. He had been expelled just 6 years before the passage of the Labouchere Amendment in 1885, the catastrophic piece of legislation that broadened the criminalization of male intimacy to include acts committed in absolute privacy. He was safely across the English Channel when the Cleveland Street scandal erupted in 1889, exposing the intersection of aristocratic men and working-class telegraph boys, resulting in highly publicized trials and frantic aristocratic cover-ups. He was completely untouched by the devastating public spectacle of Oscar Wilde's trials in 1895, an event that codified the modern homosexual identity as a strictly criminal and socially ruinous classification. Somerset watched the British state ruthlessly hunt down and physically destroy men for the exact behavior that had defined his own private life. His survival was not a testament to his innocence or a shift in the legal code. It was a testament exclusively to the timing of his exposure and the brute financial force of the Beaufort name. He had negotiated his exit just before the state sharpened its blade. He lived freely in Europe while men in London were chained to the penal treadmill. While Somerset cultivated his artistic pursuits and navigated the expatriate circles of Italy, the human collateral of his double life remained anchored in England. Lady Isabella Caroline lived with the permanent, indelible social brand of the separation until her death in 1921. She had utilized the Matrimonial Causes Act to save herself and her child, but the legal victory provided no genuine emancipation. She spent 4 decades operating as a separated woman within a society that viewed any deviation from the nuclear patriarchal family as a moral failure. She raised their son, Henry Charles Somers Somerset, entirely outside the direct influence of his father. The boy grew into a man bearing the heavy historical weight of the Beaufort legacy, yet he was forced to navigate the intense, highly judgmental networks of the British aristocracy without the guidance or the protection of a patriarch. The dynastic continuity the marriage was designed to secure was fundamentally corrupted. The father and son lived parallel lives, separated by the English Channel and the unbridgeable chasm of the 1879 allegations. Somerset's hidden life did not merely cost him his political office. It actively deprived his son of a father and forced his wife to spend the remainder of her life managing the radioactive fallout of his secret. Lord Henry Somerset died in Florence in 1932 at the age of 82. His physical death merely finalized a process of historical erasure that had been initiated 53 years prior. He died an old man, surrounded by the remnants of his musical career and the quiet comfort of his continental wealth. His passing barely registered in the political halls he had once commanded. The House of Commons, which he had entered as a young, highly touted aristocratic prospect backed by immense regional power, did not pause to recognize the end of his life. The royal household, where he had once carried the white staff of office representing the authority of the government in the presence of the Queen, issued no statements. He passed away in a foreign land, a man born to the highest echelon of British nobility who was ultimately buried far from the ancestral vaults of the Beaufort family. The state had demanded his total absence, and it maintained that absolute silence through his final breath. He had been systematically written out of the narrative of British power, his name deliberately excised from the official histories of the institutions he once served. Evaluating the historical footprint of Lord Henry Somerset requires holding two entirely contradictory realities in complete, unflinching balance. He was unequivocally crushed by a legal and social system of profound systemic cruelty. He lived in an era that aggressively criminalized his fundamental nature, offering no space, no vocabulary, and no legal protection for his existence. The Victorian state demanded the impossible, absolute suppression of human sexuality in exchange for participation in public life. When Somerset inevitably failed to maintain that suppression, the system confiscated everything it had given him. He was targeted by laws designed specifically to police morality through the threat of the prison cell and hard labor. His resignation, his exile, and the destruction of his career were the direct, undeniable results of state-sanctioned homophobia. Yet Somerset's victimization by Victorian law existed alongside an extraordinary degree of class privilege. He belonged to one of Britain's wealthiest aristocratic families and possessed financial, legal, and social resources unavailable to most people who became entangled in similar scandals. The case involving Harry Smith also exposes the profound disparity between individuals occupying radically different positions within Victorian society. Somerset's career and reputation were destroyed, but his wealth still allowed him to leave Britain and rebuild a comfortable life abroad. That distinction is essential to understanding both the severity and the limits of his downfall. He was condemned by the laws of the British Empire, stripped of his political rank, and banished from the society he was born to rule. He was forced to abandon his homeland in disgrace, his reputation permanently destroyed. Yet he lived out his days in the absolute comfort of Florentine villas, sustained by vast aristocratic wealth, recognized across the continent for his musical compositions, and entirely insulated from the physical violence of the state. He was an aristocrat who became an outcast, a lawmaker whose political future disappeared, and a man simultaneously punished by an intolerant legal system and protected from its harshest material consequences by extraordinary wealth. Lord Henry Somerset's story therefore resists a simple moral verdict. He was a casualty of a Victorian society that criminalized same-sex relations, but he was also a member of an elite whose wealth provided escape routes unavailable to most people. His downfall damaged not only his own life, but also the lives of his wife, his son, and others drawn into the scandal. That contradiction, not a simple story of victimhood or guilt, is what makes his case historically significant.